Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the afternoon, Robert Pondiscio. Robert Pondiscio is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, teaching, school choice, and charter schooling. Before joining AEI, Mr. Pondiscio was a policy analyst and education reform expert at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is an educational policy think tank. He previously worked for the Core Knowledge Foundation and as an advisor and civics teacher at Democracy Prep Public Schools. Mr. Pondiscio became interested in education policy issues when he started teaching 5th grade at a struggling South Bronx public school in 2002. Before that, he worked in journalism for 20 years, including in senior positions at Time and Business Week. He's the author of many books, including How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. He has an MS in elementary education from Mercy College, a BA in English from SUNY Empire State College. Please join me in welcoming Robert Pondiscio.
Good afternoon, thank you. I'm going to start by just saying what a pleasure it is as an adult to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Earnestly, the only other place in my life where I get to recite the pledge regularly is at the Medusa, New York Volunteer Fire Department, where I'm a volunteer fireman, and we start our meetings every month with the pledge, and it's just lovely. We should do it more often. If you'd asked me as recently as last week what was the highlight of my professional life, I would say it was being invited to Harvard University about 2 or 3 years ago to talk about my last book. Some context. As a kid, I was a B student on my best day. So suffice it to say, I never expected to set foot on the campus of Harvard in any capacity, let alone to lecture. Well, I want to thank the Jack Miller Center and Jack for inviting me here today for what will now stand as almost certainly an unsurpassable career high watermark. I'm the grandson of immigrants, the son of a mechanic who moved his family to Long Island for better schools. That I now get to stand here and talk about education at Mount Vernon, the home of our greatest American. To use a football metaphor, I have so thoroughly outkicked my coverage. So thank you. What an incredible honor to be here. I'm supposed to talk about civic education. I hope I will be forgiven if I talk instead mostly about the civic health of our schools, what I perceive to be a crisis of trust in American education, and perhaps offer a few ideas about how we can get ourselves back on track and perhaps a little bit closer to repairing some of the fissures that have emerged in American public education. Look, it is not news to any of us to observe that there's a crisis of trust in K-12 education in this country, nor do we need to belabor the causes of it. COVID shutdowns that lingered far longer than they needed to, remote learning that pried the lid off the black box of the American classroom and broadcast lessons directly onto kitchen tables all across America. We've had fights over masking children, critical race theory, gender ideology, school board battles, social and emotional learning. That is already a long list of grievances and flashpoints before we even get to the performance of American education, the latest round of NAEP scores, which perhaps you heard about, the recently released, the so-called the Nation's Report Card, which in most states saw 20, 30 years of progress in reading and math evaporate almost instantly. This all comes at a time when there are more opportunities than ever for parents to vote with their feet and to exit local school districts. According to data from my AEI colleague Nat Malkus, more than 1.2 million students have exited public schools since the start of the pandemic in 2020, out of a total of 50 million roughly. So from my perspective, the relationship of Americans to public education has never been more in play, as it were, or it's in play to a degree that is simply unprecedented in my career and perhaps ever. Now, full disclosure, I'm a school choice and charter school proponent, so this should perhaps delight me, right? It's driving parent demand for choice and for alternatives, including for school models that I happen to admire. But this crisis of trust gives me pause, and I think it should give us all pause, and here's why. The vast majority of American children attend traditional public schools and probably always will. So I take no joy in their struggles, and I think it's worth asking what's going on. So on the one hand, it is not news also that Americans don't have much confidence in public education. Historically, our relationship with public education has been very much like our relationship with Congress, right? You know this data. We hold the institution in contempt, but we reliably re-elect our congressmen every 2 years. Same thing with schools. For decades, polls have showed that we give D's and F's to public education at large, but my kid's school, my kid's teacher, that gets an A, that gets a B. But it's starting to soften. Empirical data for you. For decades now, the Gallup's so-called Honesty and Ethics in Profession survey has shown grade school teachers, and that's the verbiage, grade school teachers, are among the most trusted professionals in the country. At the pandemic start in 2020, trust in teachers stood at 75%. Just 2 or 3 years later, it's now in the low 60s. That is an all-time low, but it's still among the highest scores in the Gallup survey relative to other professions. I think teachers are third behind nurses and doctors at the same level as pharmacists, I kid you not, and just ahead of military officers and police officers. Now, one of the standard explanations for this kind of decaying trust in education is the idea that the culture war has come for public education. Candidly, whenever this explanation is offered, I kind of push back. I always say, what do you think we do in schools? What exactly? Every nation on earth literally builds its public schools in order to transmit to its children the things that their people think that children should know. Literature, history, the knowledge that every child should possess. In other words, a school is a cultural institution. It's where children learn, either intentionally or by accident or sometimes by osmosis, the things that we praise and the things that we condemn. And not just curricular content, but ideals and values and behaviors. So no, schools have not fallen victim to the culture war. We practically invented it. It's naive to think that we can somehow avoid culture war fights in our schools. One hopes we can wage them calmly, with civility, model to our children how free and thoughtful citizens can resolve their disputes. But it is perfectly appropriate for 13,000 local school districts across the country to ask those questions that I suggested earlier. What do we want our children to learn and to know? Now, I live in a small town in upstate New York. I alluded to it before, Medusa, New York. It's a fly-speck town. The only time in 25 years in that town where I've ever stood online to cast a vote, it wasn't last Tuesday, it wasn't 2016, it was May for school board. I stood online for 20 minutes to cast a vote in my last school board election. Now, people are lamenting this, of course, that, again, the culture war is coming for schools, it's too political. As a former civics teacher, I have a very hard time taking a dim view of that. I thought it was fantastic. So look, rather than dwell on the issues that are having a chilling effect on trust, I'll spend a few minutes, if I can, trying to sketch a path back. Candidly, it might not be possible to restore full faith and confidence in public education, but even if we fail, we have to try. Again, that's where the children are. So I'll start with an attempt to diagnose the problem. And look, I'm going to state it quite bluntly. Public education, I believe, is simply adrift from its founding ideals and is becoming increasingly estranged from its stakeholders and its public purpose. Our schools are supposed to be in the business of attaching our children to their country, to their community, to civil society. But sometimes it seems that we are more interested in critiquing, not attaching kids, but attacking country, community, civil society. That's a heck of a strange business for public schools to be in, right? Benjamin Rush, one of our first great theorists of public education, observed, and I'll quote him here, that the time to develop what he called the strongest prejudices in favor of our country is during the first 21 years of life. So in 1786, he wrote, quote, a general and uniform system of education will render the mass of people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. Now, if Rush were alive today and tweeted those words, he would be canceled, of course, for wanting to make Americans, quote, more homogeneous. But remember, the founders, feared faction above everything else as a threat to the infant republic. My mentor, E.D. Hirsch Jr., noted in his book, The Making of Americans, that what he called an anxious theme runs through the writings of most of our earliest theorists about education, including Rush, Noah Webster, even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. These men saw common schools, as Hirsch says, the central and main hope for the preservation of democratic ideals and the endurance of the nation as a republic. That's what Hirsch wrote. So look, I don't think it's a stretch to say that K-12 education, public education, has drifted just a long, long way from the ideals of those early theorists. So far, in fact, that I think we've just lost sight of the shore. I'm very fond of joking that Horace Mann went to his grave without ever having once uttered the phrase college and career ready. But worse than that, we have a culture of teaching where schools and teachers are free to pursue their own agendas and assume permission structures that simply don't exist. So this estrangement takes a few different shapes. My AEI colleague Yuval Levin has famously posited that institutions that were once the molds of our characters have now become platforms for performance. In his book, A Time to Build, he described this phenomenon with the news media, with Congress. But the same phenomenon is happening in our schools writ small, I think. I'm not sure how many of you are on social media, but not a day goes by that this website, Libs of TikTok, doesn't post another video of teachers exceeding their remit and using their positions performatively in ways that I think for some of us are just frankly shocking. So there was a teacher, for example, who bragged that she removed the American flag from her classroom because it made her uncomfortable, she said. And when one of her students said, well, when they do the Pledge of Allegiance, who should we pledge allegiance to? She pointed to the rainbow LGBT flag in her classroom and suggested that one. There was an AP government teacher who was caught on a video saying, and I'll quote him, but I'll censor the quote, "I have 180 days to scare the F out of my students and turn them into revolutionaries." Another teacher in California describing his school's transition closet for transgender students that allows them to, quote, to wear the clothes that their parents approve of, come to school, then swap out into the clothes that fit who they truly are. Now look, that's not only inappropriate, it's not very bright. You know, you don't tell the kids' parents, but then you put it on TikTok for millions of people to see. I want to be clear about this. I'm not a teacher basher. I don't think that teachers behaving badly on social media is representative of the profession at large. But neither should it be quite so easy for libs of TikTok and these other social media sites to find examples every day of teachers doing this kind of thing. The fact that teachers will post these videos so publicly, unabashedly, in ways that suggest they're proud of themselves, it tells us something, I think, about the free agent culture of teaching detached from its public purpose. So don't assume that this is a matter of a handful of rogue teachers just exceeding their authority. I'll reflect on my own experience training to become a teacher and getting my master's degree in elementary education. I was certified in New York. I had to demonstrate many things to become certified and to get my master's. I had to demonstrate my willingness and ability to teach for social justice, to be a change agent. I had to show a passionate commitment to reflective practice and a commitment to, quote, teaching the whole child. No one thought it was worth mentioning to me what 20 years later seemed like just about the most important thing that I should have been asked to reflect upon. Listen, Pondiscio, you're a state actor. You're a government employee. You know, part of your commitment to teaching the whole child is understanding that that child has parents who are no less invested in that child's education than you are. They're not an impediment to the child's well-being. They're central to it. As an agent of the state, you need to, I should have been told, you need to keep top of mind that there are many stakeholders in public education. Hey, it's in the name. It's called public education. We as teachers simply don't have the authority to treat our classrooms as platforms for personal expression. Nearly 100 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Pierce v. Society of Sisters that Oregon, the state of Oregon, had no right to insist that parents send their children to public schools in the districts in which they live. The decision featured one of the most famous lines in a Supreme Court decision about education, this line about how the child is not the mere creature of the state. The government must not, quote, unreasonably interfere with the liberty of parents and guardians to direct the upbringing and education of children under their control, end quote. The first time I heard that phrase was not when I was a teacher. It was several years later when my then Fordham Institute colleague Checker Finn brought it up. I'd never encountered it in my teaching or professional development. You know, as a representative of the state, I have to recognize, I should have been asked to recognize that I wielded, whether I wanted to or not, extraordinary influence over a captive audience of other people's children. Now, to be clear, social reformers have a long history of seeing schools as venues and children as vessels for their agendas, for 100 years, for assimilating immigrants, for the temperance movement of a century ago, more recently for climate change advocacy, for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts more recently. So advocates of the social justice agenda want teachers to be professional educators and activists. And that was reinforced in my own teacher training. Bluntly, I just don't think that it is untoward or reactionary for parents and other stakeholders to say at some point, hold on a second, what's the permission structure here that allows you to impose these views on my child, whether I agree with them or not? You know, why am I as a teacher unilaterally empowered to make the decisions that I alluded to earlier about what every child in this country should know, or the ideals or values that we praise or condemn in a public school? So one problem is that public education has drifted from its founding ideals. A second problem is that it's becoming estranged from its stakeholders. But there's an even more pernicious problem, I will submit, about K-12 education. It's just so damn depressing. A few months ago, I wrote a cover story for Commentary magazine that was titled "The Unbearable Bleakness of American Schooling." It pointed out that school curriculum and culture seem almost to revel in the bad and the broken, suggesting to children that they have just suffered a great misfortune. You know, they've been born into a country that is racist to its core, whose founding documents were lies when they were written, where democracy is hanging by a thread. And of course, not that that matters, because we are just a few short years away from irreversible climate catastrophe, all but certain to render the world a burned out husk by the time they're adults. And then we wonder, why is there a mental health crisis among children? We're contributing to it. We're just not playing the adult role that we should be playing. And nor is it a given, by the way, that an American school child today will get the idea that their country is a force for good in the world, or an engine of freedom or prosperity. Quite the opposite in many occasions. So I've described this as the pedagogy of the depressed. Those of you who have been to ed school get the joke. The worst part is that it's thought to be a virtue among professional educators. We view it as a mark of our seriousness and our sophistication, that we're being real with children, right? Young adult literature, I don't know if you have teenage children or teen or tween children, it is impossibly dark these days in the name of authenticity. We want children to grapple also with honest history. Starting in elementary school, we ask them to write essays, I did this in my own classroom, about their problem. Social and emotional learning is now asking teachers to functionally be therapists or social workers, almost clergy members. We see this in civics education too. I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with action civics, and which is part of what I used to teach at Democracy Prep, a charter school in New York City, in which students ostensibly learn about government not by studying how a bill becomes law, for example, but by identifying real-world problems and developing civic skills to address them. Critics describe this, not entirely incorrectly, as training for activism. I don't strongly disagree. But the stronger critique of action civics, I think, it's simply that it's just another manifestation of this pedagogy of the depressed. Everything is bad and broken. Adults are placing these burdens on fixing things on the shoulders of children. So when education drifts from its founding purpose of citizen-making and cultivating what Rush called prejudices in favor of the country, when it becomes activism, when it dwells exclusively on the bad and the broken, I think it at least tacitly encourages children to see their community and their country as nothing more than a collection of problems to be solved, with none of the virtues and blessings of citizenship. So we want children to become problem solvers, but that doesn't mean that we want schools to become problem spotters or worse, problem fetishizers. So to be clear, I want to be emphatic on this point. I'm not suggesting that our schools should traffic in a mindless nationalism or sanitize history. Fair-minded people, I hope, can see the gratitude for what works and outrage at what's not working are equally important in a well-functioning civil society. But when only the latter is emphasized, it creates in the minds of students that their country is reflexively antagonistic to their interests, right? What we have, what we seek to preserve, the things that we praise and valorize, it's wrong, it's unjust, it has to be dismantled, root and branch. If children view their country as mostly or entirely hostile to their well-being, they can't help but get the sense that there's nothing worth protecting or preserving. So I don't think this should be a controversial notion, frankly, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong about this. It shouldn't be a controversial notion to say that public education must proceed from a moral commitment, grounded in optimism and, yes, patriotism. You have to love something before you set about fixing it. 20 years ago, I became a South Bronx fifth grade teacher. I'd been involved, I still am, with a social services agency in the neighborhood. You would have to be blind not to see the disadvantages that my students faced. Problems of poverty, of racism, of failing schools. I didn't sign up to be a revolutionary, however. I signed up because I recognized that the unfairness of this, and I wanted it to work a little bit more fairly for the students that I served. Not one impulse in my professional life, then or now, was burn it all down. Influential figures on the left and on the right are guilty of this sin, however, of discrediting institutions, of questioning their legitimacy, of attacking and seeking to dismantle them. This feels to me like a very dangerous game, a very dangerous impulse to abide and to encourage and to pass on to our children. I'm going to invoke Yuval Levin once again. Really, you should have had him here to speak to you. In a talk several years ago, and I'm going to quote him here, he wrote that, or said that, quote, "Conservatives tend to begin from gratitude for what is good and what works in our society, and then strive to build on it, while progressives tend to begin from outrage at what is bad and broken and seek to uproot it." Well, we need both, obviously. I alluded to action civics a few moments ago. When folks on the right push back against action civics, and we often do, a standard complaint that you often hear is, well, would you let a kid do his action civics project on the Second Amendment or on right to life? Would he be allowed to write an op-ed for his student newspaper opposed to transgender athletes on the school track team, or would that be deemed a hate crime? These are substantial critiques. But I think the real problem with action civics isn't that it's one-sided, it's that it's another manifestation of the darkness of public education culture and curriculum. It's the bad and broken, it's the pedagogy of the depressed. It's absent, it has no gratitude in it. It gives the impression that the various forms of civic education, or the various forms of ingratitude rather, dissent, protest, boycott, that those are our highest expressions of citizenship. Look, there's just nothing wrong with thinking that a non-negotiable for public education must be to cultivate in our children a respect, even, yes, a reverence for the beliefs, the practices, the institutions, the virtues that made America the envy of the world. If public education cultivated gratitude in American children, then the activist focus of action civics would feel very different. It would actually be what its proponents say it is, which is an earnest attempt to solve problems. It places kids as a fully engaged and active participant in the 230-year effort to build a more perfect union. But you must have that gratitude piece first, or else it is just the bad and the broken. Look, I'm going on too long. The declining but still relatively high level of trust in schools and teachers says to me that there is a base to build upon, but it will require, I think, a shift in the culture of teaching, and a shift in mindset. Less activism, more humility. Schools as molds, not as platforms. A reminder that teachers are not just public employees, but influential state actors. We cannot just shut the door and choose our own adventure and teach what we like. So K-12 teachers, I think, have to understand and take to heart that, legally speaking, they have limited latitude to impose their views on a captive audience of other people's children. But please, let's not shy away from controversial topics in schools. I want to be clear on that. Let's lean into them. Not as activists and ideologues, but as serious, thoughtful professionals. I've argued elsewhere that districts and states and schools need to adopt a code of ethics that encourages schools to teach essential yet controversial topics, but insisting on viewpoint diversity. I came out of journalism where we valorized that, but that was a long time ago there, too. Look, in sum, there's an opportunity, I think, for public education to cultivate gratitude and optimism in children and invest them in their communities, in their country. I said at the outset that I was going to talk less about civic education and more about schools as civic institutions, so I'll conclude on that note too. Those of us in civic education think it's our job to teach kids to become civically engaged, but school is not where kids learn civic engagement, it's where they experience it. What I mean by that is where they feel the civic engagement of others, of us as adults. Adults whose job is to attach them to civil society, give them not just the knowledge and skills that they need for whatever path they choose, college, career, military enlistment, but buy-in, a spirit of optimism, gratitude for our shared values and ideals, and eagerness to play their part in it. I've said for years that the only accountability that matters in schools is that when kids leave us after 12th grade, we ask them the question, are you in? Is there something that you're excited about doing? The 3 E's, enlistment, enrollment, employment, and you can't wait to get ready, to get started at it, and we've prepared you well for it. That's the ultimate accountability. So in the final analysis, American education needs nothing as badly as a reset, I think, a rethinking of the social contract between teachers, parents, and other stakeholders in schools. Yes, our highest aspiration is to nourish the soul, to inspire human flourishing, not to be a hobby horse for technocrats or social justice activists. So in sum, I think we've lost the plot, and we need to remind ourselves why we do this work. What we need is a revival, and what better moment and place to start a revival movement than in this room and among this group. Our founders, including the man in whose house we are now privileged to stand, were very clear on the public purpose of public education. He saw it far more clearly than I think that we do today. So, thank you.